The grand concert hall buzzed with anticipation as musicians took their places, tuning their instruments to perfection. In the center of it all stood Raphael, his presence commanding and his violin gleaming under the warm glow of the stage lights. This was no ordinary night tonight. He would debut a piece unlike anything ever heard before. As the orchestra began the rehearsal, the air became electric. Raphael's bow danced across the strings with precision, weaving a hauntingly beautiful melody that seemed to whisper secrets into the room. The notes climbed and fell, creating waves of emotion that washed over the musicians, and the small audience gathered for the rehearsal. Julia, seated at the grand piano, couldn't help but steal glances at Raphael. His usual confidence seemed shadowed by something she couldn't place. His movements were fluid, but there was an intensity in his eyes, a desperation almost. When the final note lingered in the air, the hall fell silent, as if the music itself had stolen everyone's breath. The conductor, an older man with years of experience, seemed at a loss for words. "Raphael," he finally managed, "what was that piece? It wasn't on the program." Raphael hesitated, his fingers tightening around the violin's neck. "It's something I've been working on," he said, his voice low. "A personal project," Julia frowned. She had known Raphael for years, but he had never mentioned composing. As the musicians began packing up, murmurs of admiration and curiosity filled the room. Raphael, however, slipped away quietly, leaving his violin behind a detail that didn't escape Julia's notice. Concerned, she decided to check on him. She found his dressing room door ajar, the faint smell of rosin lingering in the air. Inside, his belongings were scattered across the vanity, and on top of the pile lay a sheet of music. The notes were unlike any she had seen before, chaotic, with strange symbols woven between the staves. "Raphael," she called softly, but there was no answer. The room felt unnaturally cold. Taking a step closer, Julia noticed something scribbled in the corner of the sheet. "The Vanishing Symphony." Beneath the title were words hastily written in Raphael's unmistakable handwriting. "Find me where the melody ends." Her heart raced as she looked around the empty room. Raphael was gone. Julia stared at the sheet music in her trembling hands. The strange symbols intertwined with the notes seemed almost alive, drawing her in as if they held a secret too important to ignore. She didn't understand their meaning, but one thing was clear. Raphael's disappearance was tied to this mysterious composition. Determined to uncover the truth, Julia left the dressing room and headed straight to her car. The night outside was unusually quiet, the city's usual hum muted under the weight of her thoughts. She drove to the apartment of Dr. Matthias Kane, a renowned musicologist who had once been her mentor in college. If anyone could make sense of the strange notations, it was him. Dr. Kane welcomed her with his usual mix of curiosity and skepticism. His study, cluttered with stacks of sheet music and books on musical theory, smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. "You look troubled," he said, motioning for her to sit. Julia handed him the sheet music without a word. As his eyes scanned the page, his expression shifted from mild interest to intense focus. This is extraordinary," he murmured. "Where did you get this?" "It belongs to Raphael," Julia replied. "He played part of it tonight during the rehearsal, and then he disappeared. I think this, whatever it is, has something to do with it." Dr. Kane adjusted his glasses and studied the symbols more closely. "These markings," he began, "are not part of any conventional musical notation. They resemble cryptic symbols used in ancient manuscripts, almost like a code." Julia leaned forward. "A code? For what?" He sighed. "There's a legend about a symphony composed centuries ago, said to have the power to reveal hidden truths or even open gateways. It was lost to time, dismissed by most as a myth. But this? He tapped the sheet music. Bears an uncanny resemblance to the descriptions of that symphony. Julia's stomach tightened. You're saying Raphael might have been playing something dangerous? Dangerous or extraordinary, Dr. Kane said gravely. If he's truly found fragments of the Vanishing Symphony, then he may have uncovered something people have sought for generations, often at great cost. Julia's mind raced. Raphael wasn't one to believe in legends or take unnecessary risks. What could have driven him to pursue something so perilous? Dr. Kane handed her the sheet music back. Whatever this is, it's incomplete. If Raphael has the rest, you need to find it and him before someone else does. There are those who would stop at nothing to possess this. Julia nodded, her resolve hardening. As she left Dr. Kane's house, the weight of the sheet music in her bag felt heavier than ever. She had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. The answers she sought were hidden within the notes of the Vanishing Symphony. Julia spent the next morning poring over the sheet music in her apartment, the notes and symbols becoming both familiar and maddeningly cryptic. She had taken Dr. Kane's warning seriously. Whatever secrets the symphony held, she needed to uncover them quickly. A faint memory stirred in her mind. Months ago, Raphael had mentioned a fascination with the history of forgotten composers. He had spoken of one in particular, Elias Winter, a maestro from the 18th century who had vanished under mysterious circumstances after premiering an incomplete symphony. The pieces clicked together. Could Raphael's discovery be connected to Winter's work? Julia searched online, diving into obscure music archives. After hours of scrolling through aged manuscripts and faded journal entries, she found something. A letter written by Elias Winter to a close confidant. In it, he spoke of a melody that could transcend the barriers of our world, and warned that playing it in its entirety would have irreversible consequences. Her breath caught as she read the last line of the letter. The final movement lies where silence reigns eternal. The words echoed Raphael's note. Find me where the melody ends. Julia quickly pieced together the possible location. The abandoned St. Arvo's Theatre, a place known for its eerie acoustics and long-abandoned stage. It had been closed for decades, rumored to be cursed after a fire claimed the lives of a full orchestra during a rehearsal. That evening, Julia drove to the theatre. The city streets fading into desolate, overgrown roads. The theatre loomed ahead, its facade cracked and weathered. The faint sound of wind whistling through broken windows sent shivers down her spine. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of charred wood. Rows of broken seats faced the stage, where remnants of scorched curtains hung in tatters. Julia clutched the sheet music tightly as she walked toward the stage, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Then she heard it, a faint melody, drifting through the air. It was unmistakably the same haunting tune Raphael had played during the rehearsal. But it wasn't coming from any visible source. Raphael? Julia called, her voice trembling. The melody stopped. A shadow shifted in the corner of the stage. Julia froze as a figure emerged, dressed in 18th century attire, his face obscured by a hood. In his hands he held a violin. Who are you? Julia demanded, her voice wavering. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised the violin and began to play. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard, piercing, sorrowful, and otherworldly. Julia stumbled backward, the notes vibrating through her very core. As the final note rang out, the figure vanished, leaving only a single sheet of paper where he had stood. Julia picked it up with trembling hands. It was the missing section of the symphony. Raphael, she whispered, her resolve hardening. I'll find you. Julia spent the next morning poring over the sheet music in her apartment, the notes and symbols becoming both familiar and maddeningly cryptic. She had taken Dr. Kane's warning seriously. Whatever secrets the symphony held, She needed to uncover them quickly. A faint memory stirred in her mind. Months ago, Raphael had mentioned a fascination with the history of forgotten composers. He had spoken of one in particular, Elias Winter, a maestro from the 18th century who had vanished under mysterious circumstances after premiering an incomplete symphony. The pieces clicked together. Could Raphael's discovery be connected to Winter's work? Julia searched online, diving into obscure music archives. After hours of scrolling through aged manuscripts and faded journal entries, she found something. A letter written by Elias Winter to a close confidant. In it, he spoke of a melody that could transcend the barriers of our world, and warned that playing it in its entirety would have irreversible consequences. Her breath caught as she read the last line of the letter. The final movement lies where silence reigns eternal. The words echoed Raphael's note. Find me where the melody ends. Julia quickly pieced together the possible location. The abandoned St. Arvo's Theatre, a place known for its eerie acoustics and long-abandoned stage. It had been closed for decades, rumored to be cursed after a fire claimed the lives of a full orchestra during a rehearsal. That evening, Julia drove to the theatre, the city streets fading into desolate, overgrown roads. The theatre loomed ahead, its facade cracked and weathered. The faint sound of wind whistling through broken windows sent shivers down her spine. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of charred wood. Rows of broken seats faced the stage, where remnants of scorched curtains hung in tatters. Julia clutched the sheet music tightly as she walked toward the stage, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Then she heard it, a faint melody, drifting through the air. It was unmistakably the same haunting tune Raphael had played during the rehearsal. But it wasn't coming from any visible source. Raphael? Julia called, her voice trembling. The melody stopped. A shadow shifted in the corner of the stage. Julia froze as a figure emerged, dressed in 18th century attire. His face obscured by a hood. In his hands he held a violin. "Who are you?" Julia demanded, her voice wavering. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised the violin and began to play. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard, piercing, sorrowful, and otherworldly. Julia stumbled backward, the notes vibrating through her very core. As the final note rang out, the figure vanished, leaving only a single sheet of paper where he had stood. Julia picked it up with trembling hands. It was the missing section of the symphony. "Raphael," she whispered, her resolve hardening. "I'll find you." Julia stood alone on the stage, the eerie silence of St. Arvo's Theatre pressing down on her like a weight. The sheet music in her hands was the missing piece, the last movement of the Vanishing Symphony. She could feel its power, even in the stillness of the abandoned theatre. But the melody that had drawn her here was gone, and so was Raphael. She clutched the music tightly, uncertain of what to do next. Every instinct told her to leave this place was steeped in tragedy, and the shadows that lingered seemed to whisper warnings. Yet, something in the air held her there, as though the music itself was calling her. Her mind raced as she replayed everything she had learned so far. The Vanishing Symphony was no ordinary composition. It had the power to unlock hidden doors, but it came at a cost. What if playing the final movement was the key to finding Raphael, but also the key to something darker? Without fully understanding why, Julia made her decision. She would play the symphony. The grand piano in the corner of the stage beckoned her, its keys covered in a fine layer of dust. She moved toward it, each step feeling heavier than the last. The ghostly echoes of the violin's melody still seemed to linger in the air, and Julia could almost hear the faintest echo of Raphael's voice urging her on. With a deep breath, she placed the sheet music on the piano and began to play. At first, the notes were hesitant, uncertain, as her fingers brushed over the keys. But soon, the music began to flow, pulling her in as the haunting melody from the violin joined in her mind. The air seemed to thrum with energy as the notes reverberated through the empty hall. Suddenly, the room began to shift. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the symphony, and the shadows in the corners stretched and twisted as though alive. A chill ran down Julia's spine as she continued to play, the music growing louder, more insistent. It was as if the very essence of the theatre was alive, responding to the symphony. The final note of the movement echoed in the air, but instead of fading away, it hung in the room, vibrating through the floor and walls. Julia felt the ground beneath her feet tremble, and the piano keys grew cold to the touch. A soft, whispering voice reached her ears, a voice she recognized. Julia. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Raphael. His voice was faint, distant but unmistakable. Raphael? She whispered, her hands frozen on the keys. The room darkened, and a shadow moved toward her from the far end of the stage. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she saw him, Raphael, standing at the edge of the stage, his eyes wide with fear. But something was wrong. His form flickered, as though it were fading in and out of existence. Raphael, are you? Before she could finish, the shadow of Raphael was gone, and the room fell silent again. Julia stood alone, the music still vibrating in her chest. The temperature in the room had dropped drastically, and her breath came out in visible clouds. She shivered, her mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. On the stage before her lay a small, intricately carved box. Julia hesitated for only a moment before walking toward it. She opened it, her fingers trembling. Inside, she found a recording, a message left by Raphael. She pressed play, and Raphael's voice filled the silence. Julia, if you found this, then you've done what I couldn't. The symphony, it's not just music. It's a door. A doorway between worlds. Please, don't play the final movement. I've seen what it unlocks. It's too late for me, but you... The message cut off, leaving Julia with only the echo of his voice, filled with regret and fear. Julia's hands trembled as she held the small recorder, the final words of Raphael's message lingering in her mind. Please, don't play the final movement. But it was too late for hesitation. The symphony had already claimed him, and she was determined to bring him back no matter the cost. The room was still frozen in time, the whispers of the symphony echoing in the air. As she stood there in the empty theatre, holding the recording, the weight of Raphael's plea pressed on her shoulders. But deep down, she knew that the only way to find him and to understand the true nature of the Vanishing Symphony was to complete it. With a heavy heart, Julia returned to the piano. The sheet music lay before her, the final movement staring up at her like a challenge. She had already played the first part, but the last notes had yet to be touched. Her fingers hovered above the keys, the silence in the theatre almost unbearable. She glanced toward the stage where Raphael had appeared, his form flickering like a ghost. Was he still trapped between worlds, waiting for her to finish what he had started? Taking a deep breath, Julia began to play. The melody was dark, sorrowful, and more powerful than anything she had ever felt before. As the notes filled the room, the ground beneath her feet trembled again. The shadows in the corners of the theatre shifted, and the temperature dropped even further. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something vast awakening, as the final movement took shape. Just as the last note approached, a cold, almost unnatural wind swept through the theatre, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. The final note rang out, sharp and clear, but instead of fading into silence, it reverberated in the air, growing louder and more intense. Suddenly, the walls of the theatre seemed to twist, and a bright, Blinding light filled the space. Julia's heart pounded in her chest as the light swirled around her, pulling her into its embrace. Her vision blurred, and the sound of her own heartbeat drowned out everything else. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light vanished. Julia found herself standing in an unfamiliar place. The air was thick with a strange energy, and the world around her was shrouded in mist. The ground beneath her was cold, and she could hear faint, distant voices. "Raphael," she called, her voice shaky. A figure appeared through the mist. It was him, Raphael, but not the Raphael she knew. His form was translucent, flickering like a mirage. "Julia." His voice was soft but full of sorrow. "You shouldn't have played it. The symphony, it wasn't meant to be completed." Julia stepped toward him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Raphael, where are we? What happened?" He reached out, his hand almost touching hers, but it passed through her skin like smoke. "I opened the door," he whispered. "But I can't leave. Not now. Not unless—" His voice trailed off. "Unless what?" Julia asked, her heart racing. "Unless you close it. You have to close the door. There's a price for everything, Julia. I thought I could control it, but the symphony has its own will." The mist began to swirl more violently, and Raphael's figure flickered again. "Hurry, before it takes everything." Suddenly, everything went dark and the silence of the theater returned. Julia was alone again, standing at the piano. The Vanishing Symphony was complete. She could still feel Raphael's presence lingering, a faint echo in the air. The final note had closed the door, but at what cost? With a heavy heart, Julia packed up the sheet music and left the theater, the weight of the symphony's power pressing on her chest. She didn't know if Raphael would ever return, or if the portal had truly been sealed. But one thing was certain: the Vanishing Symphony was no longer just a legend. It was a warning.